Hello, everyone. Good morning or afternoon, depending upon where you are, or good evening, actually. And welcome to the Educational Collaborators webinar, The Role of School Leadership in Mitigating Cybersecurity Risk. We created this webinar because Educational Collaborators, which is a consulting organization and professional development organization, we found that too many schools in addressing cybersecurity have identified this as primarily, or in many cases exclusively, an IT related problem, where a board member or a head of school will say, what are we doing in terms of cybersecurity? The leaders that be say, I'm not sure, and they ask the IT person to take care of that. And the IT person will go out and get a very expensive $30,000 cybersecurity audit, get a packet back that thick, and then ultimately find out that nobody's really looking at that. And very little actually happens then as a result of the cybersecurity assessment. And oftentimes it's because not by any fault of their own, but members of the board or senior administration simply don't understand cybersecurity and don't feel like they have their arms around what needs to happen. So we've put together a webinar that addresses how cybersecurity really is a whole school holistic issue and not just something related to the IT. But we will be talking about several IT strategies that you can take as well in order to mitigate cybersecurity in your school. So let's get into it. First, I noticed actually just as I started that I'm wearing the same shirt that I was wearing in my photo, but I'm Alex Inman, President and Founder of Educational Collaborators. I mentioned that we're a EdTech consulting and professional development organization. We work with schools all over the world. Most of our work is in the US. And then Jamie, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jamie Brito. I'm the Chief Information Officer at Collegiate School, and I've been working in cybersecurity in independent schools now for about 6 years. Unfortunately, we had a fortuitous near miss in 2013 that was highlighted in some of MBOA's magazines, but that got me interested in the topic, and so I'm excited and grateful to join Alex and share some information with you all today.
Nothing like being a victim of cybersecurity to get you interested in cybersecurity. And one of the things that we found is that in the last 2 years, independent schools, just independent schools, have noticed a 90% increase in cybersecurity incidents. So we know that this is a topic that is important. So let's get into what we're going to be doing. So we're going to talk about how cybersecurity really is a team sport. We kind of went with a football analogy as we're in the thick of the NFL season. So this is not something that is just exclusive to IT, as I mentioned earlier, but really is a team sport, and we're going to talk about how this really is. This really does address multiple departments within your school community. We're going to talk about how this can be somewhat an overwhelming and daunting challenge to address, and so we're going to look at some teams, first downs, or some immediate things that you can start to do, and then we'll start talking about being thoughtful and strategic in building your playbook for a more comprehensive cybersecurity assessment and how to go about doing that at a strategic level. And then at the end, we've got a special announcement for Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Some of you may have already heard it, but if you've not, please stick around so that you can hear our special announcement. Before we kind of get started, let's get to know our audience a little bit. So Jamie, can you put the link of our first survey into the chat? So you should be using the Zoom, see a little blink, and it should point out a chat for you with a link to a form. If you could all click on that, I'm going to escape from the presentation and start to show the responses to the survey as they start to come in. So asking about what's bringing you here today, and have you experienced a cybersecurity event at your school? Take a moment to fill out the survey and we'll take a look at those results. Jamie, can you confirm that you're seeing the results?
Yes, I am.
Very good. All right, just a quick little, why are you here? So looking for to gain knowledge, professional development, stay aware, ongoing interest, general information gathering and professional development. In terms of responses, 13 responses, well 14, they're still streaming in. 78.6% of our respondents have experienced an email scam in their community. 28% have experienced unauthorized access to email system. We'll be talking a little bit about that later on. Stolen phone or computer, 35%. Ransomware, ooh, two folks, 14% have experienced ransomware. I'm very sorry, we'll be talking about some strategies around that. And 28% have not experienced a cybersecurity event. That's actually, that's a low group, so it's good that it's, I mean, it's good that 4 of you have not experienced that, but sad that it's as low as it is. Okay, let's pop back into the presentation. Pop in the full screen. Okay, so just a quick set of assumptions before we jump into our agenda, where we're going to start going through kind of a tabletop exercise. The first is just assumptions associated with this. We are assuming, and just so we are all kind of on the same page here, we're assuming that you recognize that cybersecurity is a risk for your school, and we got that impression from the survey results. And we would like to think or hope that you recognize that cybersecurity is something that you need to deal with holistically, and we'll be arming you with information about that. A few pieces to arm you with this is the National Association of Independent Schools, a little less than a year ago in December of 2018, sent out a legal advisory on cybersecurity, where they talk about how it does bring reputational, financial, and legal risks to educational institutions. The reality is all of us are at risk. We must be responding to this risk, and this risk requires you to actively engage and address this risk. So that's the assumption that we're bringing into that. If you have a community that does not operate under that assumption, I encourage you to, if you're an NAS member, to go back and look at the NAS Legal Advisory. The NAS Trend Book is also accessible through their bookstore. You can go to the National Association of Independent Schools, just nas.org. You can go to their bookstore and purchase their Trend Book, where cybersecurity is discussed as one of their major trends that schools need to be addressing. So we just wanted to point those 2 resources out to you to help your school community recognize that this is a broader issue, and we're hoping that most of you here recognize that already, and we'll get into that. Jamie, anything to add before we get into the tabletop?
No, that sounds good, Alex. Thank you.
All right, I'll hand it off to you, please.
Great, thanks so much. So we have, as a tabletop exercise, a modified example that happened to a school, and we're going to kind of walk through the different aspects of it. It's what I would call a gut punch for me. It's a very difficult example. It did happen, and again, it kind of connects to a lot of different aspects, both in terms of technologically, how could this have been addressed, as well as from a people and from a process point of view. So the example that we have here is that an admissions officer at a school's email account is accessed, and in the account, the crooks discover waitlist information. They realize what they have, and they create a phony acceptance letter and a phony link to pay a deposit. And then they send out that email to the people who are on the wait list, and bit by bit, they start to pay the deposit. The school doesn't know any of this is happening, and eventually families start to call the school and say, hey, I got my notification that I was off the wait list, and I paid my deposit and I haven't heard from you. What's going on? So that is what happened. And what we want to do is kind of talk a little bit about how would we respond to that, as well as how could we have prevented that from happening. Are there any kind of clarifying questions or comments at this point about that?
Yeah.
Okay, you want to say that here or type it in the chat window, either way. All right, I'm not seeing the question, so we can come back to that as we go through. But again, that's kind of the setup of this is an email breach account, and they were able to identify the wait list and then send out scam emails to the folks who are on the wait list. Alex, you want to go to the next screen? So let's think about this in terms of what would the response be? Who would be the people to respond? You know, what role is it with admissions in terms of the fact that they're the ones that own the relationship with the impacted families? You know, how do they find out who included it, who paid for it? How are they going to manage those pieces? Communications, you know, what is the message going to be to the community and to the parents that were impacted? The business office, you know, people thought that they gave money to the school. How are they going to address that part? Technology, how did this happen? How could it have been prevented? How do we know what's going on? And security, in terms of if we're going to be talking to law enforcement, would we be involving the security department and or the legal department? And finally, you know, what role do the head and the CFO or the board have to play in this? So let me send you a link and get a sense, again, a survey of how do you think you would address this. And I see a question coming up here. Yes, this was access to the email account through the password and the username being phished. So it was would have been prevented by two-factor authentication.
And we'll actually be talking a little bit about some of the mitigation strategies in there, Glenn. So thanks for that. So take a look at the second survey here. This is the link that ends EL7. Is that correct, Jamie?
Yes.
Okay. I will pop over to that. As the responses flow in.
Alex, the print is a little small there. Can you maybe talk about what you're seeing?
I sure can. So right now we're seeing roughly 2/3 of the respondents are saying a combination of all of them. It's bouncing between like 70 and 66%. We got 20% who are saying that this would be an admissions issue. Actually, no, sorry. You shouldn't be asking a colorblind guy to interpret a color wheel. 23% are saying head, CFO, or other member of the school leadership. A smaller number, if I mouse over, I'll get my percent. 5.6%, one person is saying technology, and one person is saying communications. So we're ending up with the majority, vast majority saying a combination or all of them, a team approach, which we like to see, and then 4 saying head, CFO, or other member of the school leadership, which I think also probably relates back to culture. Are you ready to go back to the slide, Jamie?
I am, thank you.
Yes, sir.
And can we go to the next slide, please?
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about what Glenn was asking. You know, this is what's known as a credential phishing attack, where the admissions officer received an email that was bogus and asked them to put in his username and password, and that was captured and then the hacker went into the account. And what is impressive to me about the skill and the intelligence of the folks we're facing on the other side of this, the criminals, is I don't think that they were really targeting an admissions office, but I think that they can quickly figure out how to monetize the data that they've gotten. And so in this case, they realized what they had, and they had the wherewithal within their criminal enterprise to have someone create a fake page that looked like the schools, to be able to take payment and to be able to transfer that payment out so that they could keep the money that they stole, which was really their main intent, right? And I think in many cases what we're seeing, the main increase is around crooks making money. There was a Wall Street Journal article recently that speculated that North Korea may have made up to $2 billion through its cyber attacks like this, through ransomware and other types of things. And so there's big money to be made in this, and that tends to be the motivation. And then, as we're looking at this, the part of the complication is that the link was sent from the official school account. And so, families were understandably taken in by that. They were excited, the psychology of this attack. You're on the wait list, you're excited to do it, you want to pay to secure your place. They probably included some messages about, you need to do this in a certain amount of time. And then they were able to take away the money. So again, I'll kind of ask from a chat window perspective, are there folks who want to ask a question or make a comment here about this particular tabletop?
Okay. See nothing on chat. Shall we move on?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of what we would recommend as best practices and reasonable precautions, that there are some main elements that we would want to look at here. The first is cybersecurity awareness training for staff members. And that could take a number of forms. A popular form is folks are using simulated phishing exercises where either a third party or the school can figure out to send a phishing message that they can then see who fell for it, who clicked on the link, or who put their username and password in, as well as kind of face-to-face training in which there's just a discussion about what are the threats and how do we protect them, how do we mark messages as phishing, that type of thing. And then the other one, as Glenn alluded to earlier, is that two-factor authentication is probably, from my perspective, the most important thing we can do in terms of preventing this type of unauthorized access to the email account. And we know that over 80%, closer to 90% probably, of all cybersecurity events begin with an email, that it's the easiest kind of threat vector for criminals to get into our schools and our systems. So, that's the other one that could happen. But we know that these two things frequently aren't happening, in part because they require, more than just a technical configuration. If you turned on if I as the CIO or tech director turned on two-factor authentication and had not done the proper kind of support building and understanding and experimentation with that, with the faculty, and people couldn't get into their email, that would be a frustrating exercise for many folks. So, that's what we're kind of looking at here is who would need to be involved with making these decisions at your school. And for me, when we had the incident in 2013, that was what we would call a high heat moment. And so that gave us the impulse to go forward and begin looking at that. And we began with those who had the most sensitive information or who would be most embarrassed by having their account accessed, reputational harm. And so we began with the admin team. And once they were done and had kind of digested it, they were food tasters, so to speak. And once they had figured it out and had come to accept the minor inconveniences that came with it, and those were greater in 2013 than they are now, we then expanded to other people in their office. So those who were in HR or those who were in the development office or the business office. And we kind of continued to expand that circle until 2 years later, we finished up with part-time music teachers. They were the last group to be done.
Yeah, and I'm glad you talked about that, and we'll chat a little bit more about the role that administrators have to play in that. But the truth is, if administrators are not taking the lead in two-factor authentication, I think that that's one perfect example of a very simple and extraordinarily effective IT solution that doesn't happen without the support of school admin. Which kind of brings us to the next point on here. Whoops, went too far. Teamwork. So the good news about cybersecurity being a sort of whole community approach is that schools in general are pretty good at taking a team-based approach and a community-based approach to the work that we do. I mean, in schools, we are fundamentally communities. And so when we take the step back and start to think about cybersecurity in the same way that we think about community building and communication and efforts for messaging for enrollment building, and start to think of it as more than just a single slice of the school, but rather as a community effort, schools are good at it. And we tend to make good progress when we address it that way. Our challenge too often is simply that we just don't think of cybersecurity that way because it feels too technology oriented. So kind of moving on to that then, how does a school start to think about cybersecurity from a community standpoint? And what we recommend is that when we're doing our cybersecurity assessments with schools, we actually require that the school put together a cybersecurity team. And that team needs to be comprised of school leadership, which is often, we're looking for like an academic leader. So a head of school, associate head of school, director, superintendent, assistant superintendent, building level principals, or division leaders as the school leadership, so that there's somebody that everyone can sort of look at and say, oh, okay, that person's sort of my leader. Risk management, which is oftentimes the business manager or CFO of an organization, somebody who's the person who's really dealing with other risk scenarios. A privileged data user. So these are the people who are managing your transcript data, whether it be like a registrar or somebody in the main office or an assistant to a principal. And if you're a small college or a private school, then of course I think you'd be looking at your your development person who's dealing with the database in your advancement office. And then obviously somebody from technology, somebody who can speak to the implementation of a variety of the things that go in there. Bill Stites gives a comment. Some of the best training that you can do with faculty is to ground it in how much it impacts them in their lives and not just from a school perspective. If you make examples personal, it really helps drive the message home. And I think that is consistent with what Jamie was saying when he's talking about the school leaders and helping the school leaders recognize the role that it plays for them. I worked at a private school that had a lot of high profile people in Washington, D.C. and be sure about it. The newspapers were paying attention to what happened. And if there was some sort of salacious problem that happened at school, it would end up on the front page of the Washington Post. And so the head of school used to say to us, in terms greater than just cybersecurity, he would say, please don't do anything that's going to get your name on the front page of the Washington Post, because usually if it's associated with the school, you're going to be on page 17 for something good. You're only going to be on the front page for something bad. So try to avoid that. I always thought that was sage advice. So a tool that we use at Educational Collaborators, and it's freely available, and so we encourage you to go get this yourself if you haven't already seen it. Atlas is the Association for Technology Leaders in Independent Schools. Their website is The Atlas. Jamie, if you can just throw the link into there. There you go. So Jamie just put in the link to the cybersecurity recommendations. So these are freely available. There's 48 recommendations. They're organized into 4 levels, sort of a getting started, level 1, level 2, and level 3. And the way those were organized, and Jamie actually chaired the committee that put these together, they're sort of structured so that based off of your security profile, how far should you go down into these levels? Everyone should do the getting started. Everyone should do the beginning one. But you should be looking at what's your risk profile. So even though the school that I was at in Washington, D.C. was not a super large school, it's 1,400 students, because of some of the people that we had on campus, we really were a level 3. We even had like Secret Service as part of our security profile. So we really needed to have a high level of security profile. You need to, as a school, kind of figure out what is your level, and then start looking at the level of implementation of the 3 categories of cybersecurity at your school. So which is the next thing that I wanted to chat about, is that another thing that I like about the Atlas recommendations is they do a nice job of saying, what are the technical recommendations that we have for you? What are the personnel procedures and the general policies? Particularly when you start talking about general policies and personnel procedures, a lot of those recommendations cannot be implemented by the IT team alone. So this is where it really is important for the overall administrative team and risk management team of the school to start to look at these recommendations so they can find out how they should be implemented in their particular school. So these are available for you. We use them, and then what we do is then we put them into a survey, and we put that team together that I mentioned above, and we ask that team to go through our online survey, which asks schools to self-reflect on the level of implementation that they have across these recommendations, across these 3 categories. And then we've added weighting as well as sort of granularity in terms of scale to see where are you as a school community on implementing these recommendations. And then it kicks your answers out and auto scores them into a dashboard so that we can show sort of green, yellow, or red, how well are you doing in implementing these recommendations across your community. And it's a great start to kind of get a sense of visually where are we as a school, and how well are we doing at cybersecurity. And that's the good part. The bad part, just being transparent with you, is as you see on this particular school's response, there's a lot of red on there, and that can be very overwhelming. And so what we want to do is help you recognize that you don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to do everything. What we want you to do, though, is start to identify what are the things that are going to be most important for you and focus on those just to start getting started, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But an important piece that I want you to take away from this webinar is once you assess, once you do your due diligence and you identify where your risks are, you have already helped yourself in providing legal defense for yourself should a cybersecurity incident happen at your school, if and only if you can demonstrate that you have used the information that you gathered through this due diligence to actually begin acting on it. So what I'm saying is, let's say that you find your needs, you then identify what it is that you're going to start working towards, you start working towards those, and then an incident happens that is outside of the area that you've been working. You actually have, at least we're being told by lawyers and insurance experts, that you have mitigated your risk, even though you have not worked on the incident, the cybersecurity protocols around the incident that you occurred. If you have done the due diligence to identify your risk, set forth a plan, and then began working on that plan. So it's important to identify those things that you're going to start working on, and that's our focus on first down section. And Jamie, can you take it from here, please?
Sure, thanks, Alex. So again, it can be overwhelming when you look at all of the things that are recommended, But as we use this analogy with football about getting yards and first downs, we need a yardstick. You know, we need to know what's the first thing that we need to do. And so I think that's really important. And what I've seen in my work with schools and in my own school is that you need to look at it in terms of baby steps. You need to see what the appetite is at that moment, where's the highest risk, and where is the easiest or the low-hanging fruit that you can address. And so two things that I'll say again is that we know that ransomware and unauthorized access to email accounts through those phishing examples like we saw before, as well as the rise of something called business compromise email, where, you know, it's the headmaster asking you to send the gift cards, that those are the, by and large, the three largest threats that we face in independent schools, where we have, you know, potential for loss of reputation or potential loss of money. And so we want to look at, you know, what's the most important thing, to continue the analogy a bit, you know, what's the basic blocking and tackling that we need to do. And so I think from a risk management perspective, it's always good to think about what is reasonable practice for our community, right? And so Alex, if you can go to the next slide, please. How does your school compare? How does your school compare with what other independent schools are doing, what the recommendations are? And again, Alex mentioned NAIS as a legal advisor on this that came out last year. I'll go ahead and put the link for that in the chat window as well. And depending on your browser, you may need to be a member of NAIS to see this. I've spoken to them, and if you will just email them and tell them that you're interested in it and you saw it in the webinar, they're happy to send you a copy, but they'd like to know, you know, who's interested. But again, I found that sometimes that will pop up even if I'm not logged into the portal. So I think, you know, again, from a leadership perspective, what is it reasonable for us to be doing? And part of that is defined by our community. Our definition of reasonableness may be different than, say, a bank or you know, a credit card company or something like that. So next slide, please, Alex. Educational Collaborators does a tie survey where they're getting data from different schools on these types of benchmarks. It's early in the process, and I'd love to see, you know, this get larger from other data sources as well. But what we see is that schools on average spend 3.66% of their technology budget on cybersecurity, and they're devoting a little over half of an FTE to cybersecurity. And so, you know, I think about that in terms of small schools, medium schools, and large schools. But that is a significant demand that really wasn't in our schools. It certainly wasn't that high at my school, you know, 5 or 6 years ago. And so how do we create the time and space as leaders that we've given it the right resources and the right amount of direction, you know, as we face a lot of competing needs for technology and what we're going to be doing with that? And again, I guess I would say that anyone who has a question or comment as we go forward would be fine. And thank you, Alex, for the next slide, though. In terms of establishing what that best practice might look like or what that reasonable care is, an encouraging trend for me over the 4 or 5 years that I've been working with schools on this is to see the increase in the number of schools that have completed cyber insurance and have that for their programs. You see here on this graph from our last sample that 70% of schools have that completed. And so I think, you know, that's a good thing. That makes sense for a lot of reasons. Having cyber insurance gives you an umbrella. It gives you structure. It gives you someone to turn to if you have an event, and they do a great job of what's called incident response. And so they're going to kind of walk you through there. They're going to connect you with the experts, the legal experts or the cyber forensic experts that you might need. They're going to have communications help. And I think what's interesting about that, you know, because we're going to see some other bar graphs that aren't quite as positive in terms of that many schools, that larger percentage having completed the recommendation. But Alex, if you go to the next slide, from a risk management point of view, one of the recommendations Atlas has is that you have background checks upon hire. That is, again, a form of due diligence. And we see that, you know, almost 100% of schools have done that background check. My sense is that things like two-factor authentication, things like cyber insurance, things like backups that are off-site or disconnected from the network in case of a ransomware attack, that over the next few years, my hope would be that we're going to see the bar graph shift to the right here as well and move towards, that we'll look at cybersecurity in the way that we look at background checks as well. Next slide, please, Alex.
Yep. Did you want to send the link?
Yeah, sorry about that. Why don't you go back?
Sure.
I got ahead of myself. Let's see, where is my third link? There it is. It's always nice to have a co-pilot. Did that go through? I don't see that one.
It did. It's just the link below the PDF. So if you guys look at the chat, we have another survey for you. It ends HE66.
Oh, I see. It continued. Got you.
If you will take a look at that. And
so this is asking how many of us today have two-factor authentication turned on to our school accounts.
And are you currently using multi-factor authentication in your email account, school email account? It's coming in. We're looking at around 70% responding no two-factor authentication, and 7.7% at not sure, and 23% at yes. Oh, jumped up to close to 30%.
So one takeaway from today is that if you are a senior leader at your school, that would be something I would ask you to talk to your tech department about today, of how can you enable that, at least individually on your account, if not for others. But the good news, bad news is that, this is not unrepresentative of schools as a whole. And Alex, if we can jump back to the presentation, please.
Yeah. Oh, hang on.
Could be a cyber risk there.
Yeah, we've got a, there we go. There we go. I'm gonna move my chat window here to go full screen. There we are.
And then can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So in our survey, you see that 60% of folks have not done this at all in their schools, or that they're at the initial steps. And only 24% of schools who have completed the survey have said that, yes, they've completed two-factor authentication. And this question, Alex talked about the scope earlier. This is just for campus users with access to secure or sensitive data. And so again, I think that's an important part. And we see a comment from Glenn over on the side.
Not required for the entire domain.
Right. Yeah.
So
that's a good.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Alex. No,
I was going to say that it's a good point. There really are, and it doesn't necessarily. Well, it'd be great if it's for the entire domain, but there are stages to this, as Jamie pointed out earlier, and he started with certain members of the community. But I think it's really important that it be more than just the IT people, that you really start to extend this primarily to those who have access to privileged data. Sometimes, and we're talking about some of the academic leadership, people who have access to some of the most sensitive information, nurses, etc., are people who are sometimes afraid of technology. And because they're afraid of technology, they're resistant to multi-factor authentication. But they are actually the people who represent the highest reputational risk to your organization. And that's important to note.
Yeah, and back to the football analogy and the yardsticks and getting yards and first downs, getting some people on two-factor authentication is a way, like, if you're backed up against your goal line and you can do a few draw plays up the middle, that's a good start. And I think for my school, having people have experiences with it, particularly the leadership, that began to kind of socialize the concept of, oh yeah, I'm using two-factor authentication. I had these bumps in the beginning, but now it's fine. And I think the other thing that supports us doing this as a community is that two-factor authentication is much more widespread today than ever. You see it growing in terms of TIA has it, banks accounts have it, you know, private email accounts have it. It's really becoming the norm. And while it's not perfect, as Glenn alluded to earlier, it is a strong statement and certainly a reasonable protection. And the lawyers and the insurance folks I've spoken to have said that should someone give out their username and password and have two-factor authentication on their account, you can reasonably conclude that no sensitive information was put into the open. And that is a wonderful thing.
Jamie, we have one more question.
So
is there any difference between a standard employment background check performed for all staff and the type of check for IT or data systems?
I don't think so. You know, that's a good question, and one I'll talk to some of my legal friends about. But we're basically looking for, you know, that lack of criminal record or past. I haven't heard of anyone doing a more extensive background check for IT. But if anyone else has heard of that, that would be good to share, and that's certainly something that I'll take away from today and see what I can do.
Very good. We're getting a few other questions coming in. We have time for questions at the end. I'll keep reading these. But Jamie, we've fallen about 4 minutes behind our schedule, so we need to pick it up a little bit.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah. So you want to go ahead to the next slide, please?
Yep, business continuity.
Oh, okay, so business continuity, right. So we talked about email two-factor authentication because that is probably the greatest threat vector. The other one that we're seeing is the increase in ransomware, particularly because of the money it can make. And so again, this slide speaks to where we are as a community, but also the next one will speak about kind of the sequencing of how do we make progress towards those first downs. And so generally speaking, we see that most schools have started some form of disaster recovery or business continuity. And in this case with ransomware, what that means is that if your servers have been infected with ransomware, which essentially encrypts the hard drive so that you can't use it anymore, do you have the ability to restore from a recent backup and get back working without having to navigate paying the ransomware, which we've seen this past fall and year, you know, small municipalities, large municipalities, Atlanta, Baltimore, other counties were really being targeted because of the cost, the profit that criminals can make. So if you go to the next slide, Alex, you know, we see that people have begun talking and planning, but the highest level, the level 3 that we've talked about, says, have you tested your business continuity plans in a drill? And that none of the schools had done that. And some, you know, a few had taken some initial steps or had made solid work to that. But it's kind of analogous to, you know, having fire drills and tornado drills or other types of drills that we have in schools. And so we need to find that time and space for IT departments to test this. And the benefit of Atlas's recommendations and EC's work is that they help schools identify where the gaps are and where they should spend their limited time and money to get the most benefit for their efforts. And with that, Alex, I think I'll pass the speaking stick back to you. Is that right? Or I have?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
And some of the questions that are coming in will be addressed a little bit in this next section before we wrap it up and get to the individual questions. So some of the questions are, what policies do you recommend for data and emails, and also like how deep do you bring down two-factor authentication? And the answer is it depends, and it depends on your school and where you decide you need to be. The nice part about the recommendations, the Atlas recommendations that we built, and I failed to mention earlier, there's 48 in that. When Educational Collaborators works with a school, we have 56 recommendations. We've updated them a little bit and tweaked them a little bit to reflect this very rapidly changing cybersecurity landscape. So the part of building your plan and making decisions for your school begins with identifying your cybersecurity task force, your team, so that you are getting the appropriate voices from different aspects of the school into your community. And so just to reiterate, I mentioned that it involves senior leadership, risk management, privileged data users, and IT. Start by where are we now? Get a sense of where are we now relative to the various stages and relative to the various areas of IT or technology, policy, and personnel. So you can get a good snapshot of where you're beginning to figure out where you're going to go. And then also, as a community, start to, after you get that data, what stage is appropriate for your security risk profile? What's appropriate for you guys? That's something that we can help with on the outside. If you need us, I'll chat a little bit about that at the end. But you don't decide that as an IT person by yourself. Don't decide that as a head of school or a superintendent by yourself. This should be a broader conversation, thinking about this within the realm of risk management and not just cybersecurity. So in doing that, after you've put that group together and done that self-assessment, you can do this on your own with the recommendations. What we do is we take the survey data that you provide us, and then we start to identify what are the critical, meaning biggest risk areas for you, and then what are the highest impact, sort of the lowest hanging fruit, things that you can begin to work on right away. And we start to narrow that down. So I want to kind of show you what this looks like sort of on the other side after having someone like us take a look at this, or working with teams of schools, teams at schools to start to identify this. You've seen this slide before, so we get that dashboard so you can start to see where you are. The only thing that I want to point out now that I didn't point out before is notice that we have scale scores on these things. So it's not just a yes or no, on or off on each of these things, but there are different levels and granularities of implementation. This is particularly important if the request to do this came from senior leadership or the board, where you want to say, okay, we've made some progress. Maybe not as far as we should, but we've made some progress. I think the level of granularity associated with our survey versus just sort of the on and off yes or no's gives you a little bit of a more granular picture on these, which I think is valuable. I mentioned earlier that it's important to have a plan after you've done your due diligence of going through a tool like the Atlas Cybersecurity recommendations, or after going through our cybersecurity assessment, or looking at other standards. After you've done that, it's important to start to put a plan together. What are the items that you have identified as your greatest risk and lowest hanging fruit, and what are you going to start doing about it? So what we do is we put together sort of a cybersecurity roadmap. It's not a firm plan, but it comes up with major recommendations and identifies sort of the why behind those major recommendations. So you know, the nice thing about an Atlas cybersecurity recommendation sheet is that it gives you a lot of clear, quick information. It doesn't give you a lot of the rationale behind why the various recommendations exist at each of those stages. And someone like us, or maybe your IT staff, can provide you some of that context. But we provide
don't have an IT staff.
I'm sorry? Yeah, just ask the question again. I didn't hear the question again, but throw it into chat, and I'll see it. I'm sorry that I didn't hear your question. I talked right over you, I'm afraid. Items to provide context, like for example, 80% of all cybersecurity attacks begin through email. So that as you're sharing your rationale for your recommendations, there is broader understanding from folks like your board or various department heads to understand why that is. And forgive me because I'm running fast because I want to make sure that we have time for your questions. And then what we do, and feel free to take this and use this on your own, is we put, so you're going to have multi-factor authentication. What are the steps to that? And it's not just turn on multi-factor authentication in your Google or inside your Exchange environment, but set up the configuration, identify the leaders, work with them individually, put out that process, and identify who's responsible for the steps in those processes and the key milestones and targets and status. Fundamentally, this is just like the SMART goals process. Here's the thing that I want to point out though, as you're listing out what needs to happen and who's responsible, if you find that it's just the IT person or just one person that shows up in the who for all of these things, well, that's a clue that you're not doing it right. So you'll want to make sure that there is some breadth to the approach that you're taking. If it's all one person or one entity or one department, then you're probably not thinking about that particular cybersecurity need as broadly as you should be. I want to quickly point out how EC can help in some of this, and then we'll move into questions with our last 5 minutes. So Educational Collaborators, I mentioned, is a educational consulting and professional development organization. And so we have 3 offerings that I think align mostly with what we're talking about today. First is our Ed Tech Audit. This is by far the most comprehensive approach. We're not just looking at cybersecurity, but we come in an audit and we look at academic technology, staffing, infrastructure, and data flow. And there are cybersecurity components associated with each of those, but also much broader areas that don't really deal with cybersecurity. And but if you're looking for that whole picture technology review, this is the way that we do it. The cost varies mostly based off of the size of your organization, but comes in at roughly around $25,000. But the return on investment, typically our clients are telling us that the immediate savings that they get from the work that we do is anywhere from $50,000 to $150,000, and in many cases that's annual savings. So it's nice. It ends up being a good, worthwhile investment for them. We have a much more narrow, low-cost, focused cybersecurity assessment where we're looking at the best practices. It's fundamentally what we've talked about here, where we help you put together your team. You go through the cybersecurity assessment. We kick out that dashboard, interpret that dashboard, and work with you to build a cybersecurity roadmap. The cost is dependent upon your school size, because that also is more typically reflective of your security profile, your risk profile, and also the sophistication of your cybersecurity environment. So it may require a little bit more work for us to do. So this is just under $5,000 for public districts. An individual school over 500 is $4,000, and then schools that are under 500, the cost is $2,500 to work on that. We turn those around pretty quickly. Typical return on investment that we're hearing is around $20,000 in terms of operational savings, as well as some risk mitigation savings that they've received as well. This is a newer offering that we have, so I'll be honest, the ROI may be larger or smaller, and we'll determine that better with time. But here's our special announcement that I wanted to mention. This is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. October is, so through October 31st, if you sign up for our small school, this is only for schools, individual schools that are 500 or fewer students, or public school districts that have 3,000 or fewer students. They have similar risk profiles. For those schools who sign up before the end of October 31st, we're going to offer basically the dashboard, the assessment. We'll put the team together, do the assessment, do the dashboard, and walk you through. We won't write out a roadmap for you, but we will help you interpret the dashboard for only $1,000. So this offer is only $1,000 and only available through the end of this month, which is only like 6 or 7 days left. So if you go to educollaborators.com/smallschoolcybermonth, you will find a link to connect with our sales staff and order that. But please, if you want that, order it. If you want this at all in your small school, order this before the end of the month. It is worth it. It is absolutely worth it. Okay, so questions that you have. Let me get to some that we have. Jamie, do you have the chat window open as well?
I do.
So the first question that we haven't directly addressed is policies that we recommend for what data should or should not be sent in email. Do the Atlas recommendations talk about that? Is that something that we can provide folks?
Right. So I don't know that specific policy is in the Atlas recommendations. I'm pretty sure it's not. I think the question that I am familiar with there is what's generally referred to as email retention. And that kind of goes to e-discovery and varies significantly from school to school based on the risk profile and what they've heard from other folks or from lawyers. And so it has ranged from 1 year to 5 years in terms of how long emails are kept, because I think you're right that if a criminal is in the account, they can quickly download all of the emails and then look through them at their leisure. The risk factor really is more about e-discovery, though, I think, when we look at this issue. And And again, I think that that's a question, you know, and depending on your system in terms of what is sent in emails, there are increasing tools to help you identify what's being sent and what's there. At Collegiate, with the kind of the simple is better approach, because we use two-factor authentication on our system, we know that that data is protected, and we can reasonably conclude that it's safe. The other question was on two-factor authentication for students. I think that's a good idea, but again, in terms of critical yardage to pick up, because students are not employees of your school, you do not have the same liability if their accounts are accessed. And there is a fair amount of inconvenience, or, you know, getting that set up and required for them to have their phones with them to get the code when they need to log in. And so I think that schools are maybe even a little bit slower to do students than they are their own faculty. But I do agree that in an ideal world, we would have students taken care of as well. And part of it is that it helps minimize the risk to the domain. One time I was aware of a school that had students' accounts be accessed, and the crooks were sending a lot of messages through their accounts. And those messages from the school started to have a banner at the top that said, you know, be careful, this domain is known as sending suspicious emails. And so that's a reputational risk of another flavor. And then we have a question about cloud-based services in terms of mitigating the threats. And so I agree that cloud-based systems generally are less vulnerable to ransomware as it's currently configured, and that is part of a mitigation strategy. There are, you know, some additional questions in the Atlas recommendations about the due diligence you've done and questions you've asked your third-party providers, and that you're understanding your obligation if they were to suffer a breach. But generally speaking, I am not aware of cloud-based systems that have been affected by ransomware as much as I have been those that are in the systems. And many of our systems are in the cloud. What we would face in a ransomware attack is a lot of our access control systems, our basic network functionality, things like that.
We have a question on risk profile related to data on sheets, data exports. I manage data with our teachers, frequently maintain 5 to 20 docs with personally identifiable information data. This is a problem for all of us at our schools, and it terrifies me. So one, I do recommend that schools try to keep their information in the systems, which have greater security oftentimes than the individual devices, especially if you've got teacher laptops and they're downloading and exporting personally identifiable information onto laptops and then taking those laptops off campus. So I think that is something that needs to be addressed for sure. The other thing is, just as a recommendation, implementing and turning on data loss protection and identifying sheets with PII as protected information, so that if people try to email those things, those at least get stopped by your data loss protection policies. And DLP policies are built in for free into the Exchange environment, as well as the Google environment, G Suite environment. You don't have to have a Google Enterprise in order to do the DLP. Jamie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you know, it's 2 o'clock, so I feel like we stuck the landing.
We have. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today. Give me a little bit of time I left a little bit of junk at the beginning of the recording, so I will clean this up a little bit, and then everyone who's registered, whether you attended or not, we will send you a link to the webinar once we have it uploaded. Thank you so much. We kept almost our entire audience the entire time, Jamie, which that's a good sign. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
attention.
Everyone, for coming. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now and be ending the meeting.